Without further ado, Your Honor, do I have leave to begin now? Thank you. And I will, as I am wont to do when I appeared or used to appear before the courts, begin with the bad news. I always think it's best to articulate your opponent's strongest argument against you, right, Aaron? First-year law student. You'll learn this soon enough. And the bad news is, my friends, that, at least in my humble submission, there is a perfect storm raging through liberal constitutional democracies throughout the West. And I'll refer to liberal democracy for reasons of economy, but I mean liberal constitutional democracy. They're under siege, they're faltering, or at a minimum, they're undergoing some pretty severe stress testing. Now, we sitting here in Canada with a lieutenant governor who promotes democracy openly may not feel that sense of urgency that people are feeling in other parts of the world. But I'll suggest to you this morning and over the course of the weekend that we ought to be very concerned about what's going on here as well. But I'll look forward to your feedback and the feedback of my colleagues who will be addressing you. There is some good news, though, and the good news is that there's still reason for hope, as my friend Jane Goodall never tires of reminding us. But reason for hope is not free of charge. It doesn't come without a corresponding awesome responsibility. I think we all share that view, and that's probably what brought us together this weekend. Only a few decades ago, political theorist Francis Fukuyama proclaimed, by his own admission later, rather prematurely, he proclaimed the end of history, by which he meant that moment of dialectical perfection, of post-ideological politics presenting itself in the triumphant garb of liberal democracy, whose chief sociological precondition, at least in my understanding, is what has been called its shared epistemic foundation, by which is meant the widespread societal deference to the authority of facts, of knowledge, and of truth that underpin the marketplace of ideas, that give validity to the kinds of public policies that could engender popular support and could be capable of commanding our collective allegiance to common cause and purpose. But that marketplace of ideas is not functioning as it once did, as a kind of clearinghouse for the sharing of ideas, for the weighing and testing of arguments and facts and evidence. And I'd submit that instead of a marketplace of ideas, what we really have now is a mass culture of what I call info wars, information wars. Social media, by its very nature and structure, has fragmented the public square, cultivating a universe of metastasizing, self-affirming echo chambers. Economic inequality is increasing exponentially year over year, and indeed unconscionably so. Henry Lowton, who's here with some statistics, may beg to differ with me, but he's the optimist, and he always accuses me of being the pessimist. So we'll hear from him. He always has the good news story about what's going on, but I think there's no doubt, according to what the Conference Board of Canada, the OECD, have to say, that the income gap, the wealth disparity is increasing tremendously, and probably of all the factors that are contributing to the backsliding, and I'll come back to this, that's probably the most severe. Partisan politics have become more polarized, more deeply entrenched than they have been in generations. Hate is everywhere on the rise. Europe is once again a bastion of extremism, of nationalism, xenophobia, of racism, the likes of which it hasn't seen since the 1920s and 30s. And in my submission, North America is not free from these scourges either. So I would suggest that we need to stand back and ask whether liberal democracy hasn't failed or is perhaps in the process of failing, as it is bound to do, to deliver on some of its core promises. I think it's also necessary for us to look in the mirror and ask whether we, citizens of liberal democracy, haven't fallen down in our own collective responsibility to uphold and to enforce the promises of equality, of fairness, that are expected of the kinds of societal arrangements that are particular to free and democratic societies. Ultimately, we may have overlooked our own part as citizens in the liberal democratic equation, but it would be my submission that, frankly, we've never been taught how to be good constitutional citizens in the first place. Now, before inquiring further into the causes of the retreat of liberal democracy, of democratic rot, democratic decline, or as Nancy Bermeo has famously coined the term, democratic backsliding, perhaps we ought to, for everyone's benefit, say what it is we are or should be so deeply worried about losing. What is this liberal democracy whose retreat we lament, at least some of us in the room this weekend? What is it? Now, by liberal democracy, I am talking about that system of representative government that functions in accordance with liberal principles. Now, my conception of liberal democracy, so that we don't get into a fight about what it includes and what it doesn't include, is a big tent conception, all right? There's room for social democratic principles, for conservative principles, for ideas all along the ideological axis that still fit within the rubric of what we call liberal democracy. But it's important to note the importance of the full name, liberal constitutional democracy, because that term denotes not only the liberal democratic value system, but also the importance of law and of the legal framework in reinforcing that value system by way of legislative declaration of intent and also in enforcing the laws themselves. That is, underscoring the importance of the oversight role of an independent judiciary. That's a critical part of the equation. Now, the architecture of all liberal democracies shares certain common features. The systems may differ across nations. Some may be based on a parliamentary system, others on a presidential Madisonian model, and still others may be a hybrid or variation on one of those themes. Some may have written constitutions, others unwritten constitutions. But in every case, liberal democracies share the following features. They have a democratic electoral system. Their elections are periodic, fair, and meaningful. And that means that there has to be a genuine possibility. Andrew Scheer, if you're live streaming this, pay attention. There has to be a genuine possibility of power actually changing hands. They guarantee the basic rights of free expression, free association, and free assembly, as those are the rights that facilitate competition, both in the marketplace of ideas, but also at the ballot box. They adhere to the rule of law, not merely in terms of the independent judicial oversight of government action, but also in the sense that the entire apparatus of government functions as a rule-making, rule-abiding, rule-enforcing system that places emphasis and importance on the principles of consistency, neutrality, and procedural fairness as constant guideposts. In the last 50 years, liberal democratic ideals have expanded considerably around the idea of the inherent dignity of all persons. This has given rise to some additional elements in the liberal democratic bag of promises, including such things as constitutional commitments to the provision of basic goods such as food, education, housing, healthcare, inclusiveness in the form of discrimination, a strong prohibition on discrimination based on race, religion, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and the like. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, economic prosperity. More specifically, a measure of economic equality manifested by a strong, thriving, and ever-expanding middle class. And then liberal democracies have one very, very important requirement of their leaders that we ought to be paying attention to, especially this week, given some of the news south of the border. Leaders in a liberal democracy have to remember two things. They have to respect and tolerate the political legitimacy of their opponents and adversaries in the political process. And secondly, they have to forbear or refrain from using their powers and their authority unreasonably, injudiciously, without restraint. And they must especially be sure to forego or forbear using those powers for the express purpose of undermining the legitimacy of their opponents. When these rules are broken, democracy is put at risk. And I would submit that we're seeing more and more of this occurring throughout liberal democracies. And so we see many liberal democracies backsliding. Gradually, some of them, piecemeal, as a function of the system's inherent complexities, vulnerabilities, stresses. Some are succumbing more rapidly at the hands of elected demagogues who begin as charismatic populist leaders. Some, such as Viktor Orban in Hungary, Recep Erdogan in Turkey, actually began as liberal reformers. But then they quickly depart from constitutional norms and move to dismantle the institutional machinery of political accountability. In the case of Orban and Erdogan, they were elected liberal reformers, and then they got re-elected as right-wing demagogues. That's a neat trick to pull. And there are others who are doing that as well. We'll have an opportunity to hear more about that kind of development and the Orbans, the Salvinis, the Kaczynskis, the Bolsonaros, and the populist surge when Tom Axworthy addresses us in a few minutes. It's a very, very important development and a very important factor in this process of backsliding. So let's consider some of the other factors that are currently contributing to the backsliding that's occurring throughout the West. I think at or near the top of everyone's list, and that's the third time I'm mentioning it, that's how important it is, growing economic inequality. Economic inequality poses a serious challenge for liberal democracies, which no longer seem able to assure their citizens a rapid increase in their living standards. They can't even assure status quo stability, maintaining existing living standards, let alone the rapid increase. Governments can no longer be counted on to preside over sustained economic growth, nor even to undertake that delicate but critical task of wealth redistribution to maintain stability and harmony in civil society. Then there's another important factor, and that is the challenge of multi-ethnic, multicultural demographics. The pluralist foundation of liberal democratic culture is particularly uncomfortable for populations that are culturally or ethnically homogeneous, or who hold to a very heavily, or identify very heavily with a nationalist conception of the state. So citizens now have to contend with more equal, more diverse, more multicultural democracy. Now, sitting here as Canadians, we say, well, what's wrong with that? That's a good thing. That's how we live. Or so we may think. But as Tom is going to explain to us a little later, pluralism is a problem for populism, because populism begins with a hostility to pluralism. There's a relatively new factor that I think is critically important, and it comes to us courtesy of the internet. With the advent of the internet, with all of its attendant upside, there's a downside, and it's what I'm calling its dark side. Its democratization of information gathering, sharing, manipulation, and curation poses a massive challenge for liberal democracies. In granting every person the capacity for direct engagement with and through this transformative, revolutionary technology, unmediated by the authority of the traditional truth and knowledge seekers, the free press, on the one hand, we've got Dave Seglins here to talk about that a little later, and in the scientific community, the academy, unmediated by that, and also unmediated by the traditional guardians of the traditional guardians of the mainstream political narrative. So political leaders, political parties, again, the media. Unmediated by any of those things, the internet has made liberal democracy vulnerable to erosion from within as well as to manipulation from without. And its dark side includes not only the fragmentation of discourse and the supremacy of the echo chamber as structural barrier to consensus generation across partisan and ideological lines. It's also empowered a previously marginalized and uninfluential demographic that social scientists and commentators are beginning to refer to as the chaos seekers. The chaos seekers consist of disenchanted, alienated segments of the population who feel betrayed by their governments and by their leaders, who feel preyed upon by the bankers and the hedge fund managers, who feel threatened by newcomers from abroad, who feel condescended to by the members of the ivory tower. Tom's looking away when I say that. And who feel victimized and exploited by the corporate class. This disenchantment is, needless to say, being weaponized by populist leaders whose motivations are neither idealistic nor ideological and whose promises are not programmatic. They're simply opportunistically anti-system and pro-chaos. And the chaos seekers have a deepening mistrust of higher education and of empirically based science. The result of all of this, in my submission, is a kind of chronic, persistent war on truth. And with that, the threat to that critical shared epistemic foundation on which liberal democracy reposes. Think of the now infamous phrase by Kellyanne Conway, counselor to President Trump, when she stated that the then White House press secretary, Sean Spicer, gave what she called alternative facts concerning the crowd size at the presidential inauguration. Now, as silly, as benign as that example might seem, as trivial as that example might seem, we now get that that was not a good faith effort to advance a competing account of truth. It's critically important to understand that. That, in fact, was a full frontal assault on truth, and we saw that tactic over and over again, and we see it playing out daily. The effort to render truth entirely irrelevant, to completely deny the power of truth in political discourse, in the political equation altogether. To me, that constitutes one of the most serious threats to liberal democracy. Some additional factors contributing to the backsliding: the failure of political parties to fulfill their gatekeeping and filtration functions of weeding out aspiring autocrats and those otherwise unfit for office. Their failure to advance compelling visions of the public good, or to advance or offer up convincing and credible solutions to our most difficult, intractable, and urgent problems. There's the dysfunctionality of legislatures altogether. Ma'am, you have the good fortune of presiding over a legislature. You are well aware of the quality of the debate, the toxicity that now inhabits those places. Nathalie Desrosiers is even more familiar with it because she participated. In a sense, one can say she was even complicit in it. You'll have a chance to defend yourself. And then there is the one that's nearest and dearest to my heart, and that motivated me to found Section 1, and that is what I take to be the failure of public education to teach civics. By which I mean specifically its failure to instill in our youth, and also in our citizens of all ages and all stages, but its failure to instill in them a sense of civic duty to defend political liberty. More on that shortly. There are a number of other factors. We can't go into them now. We will over the course of the weekend for sure. Now, what about the state of democracy in Canada? It's been said that Canadian constitutional democracy is particularly resilient. It's well immunized against the perils of democratic backsliding. There are political theorists who make the strong case that we are absolutely, we are a refuge in the storm, and we're completely immune. Bruce Ackerman advanced a theory about Canada's what he calls constrained parliamentarism. Canadians would say parliamentarianism, talking about the ways in which we have built-in safeguards against the backsliding. I'm not so sure. And we can look at the elements of that constrained parliamentarism later on if you want to go down that road. But the question really is, are we a refuge in the storm? I don't know, look around. We have a brand new national political party. It's a populist party. It's proudly xenophobic, it's proudly anti-climate science, it's proudly anti-pluralist. We have hate and racism online and in our streets. Just ask Dr. Karen Mock, who you'll be hearing from tomorrow on this subject. We have rapidly increasing inequality, both in terms of the income gap and the wealth gap. And then just to name a couple of stories that you probably haven't heard of, they're probably somewhere in the middle or the back page of the newspaper. There was recently a story about a prime minister who decided to interfere in the prosecutorial independence of the Attorney General and the public prosecutor. And then when the ethics commissioner found that there may have been some ethical and legal wrongdoing, the prime minister was able to casually dismiss that finding as though it was just another nasty letter to the editor. Question about accountability in our system. We have, ma'am, you've had the great good fortune of presiding over this, a premier who, without any electoral mandate, simply eliminated 50% of Toronto's city council in mid-municipal election, no less, and in doing so, threatened to invoke the notwithstanding clause, Section 33 of the Constitution. I don't know whether Natalie's going to make any reference to it as a counterpoint to Section 1. I hope she does. As though that section, by the way, for those of you who haven't read it, it's the section in the Charter that allows the legislatures to provisionally suspend the operation of the Charter. A number of conditions around that. And the Premier threatened to use that as though it was just, in his words, just another tool in my constitutional toolbox, as though he couldn't decide on whether to use a wrench or a screwdriver for the job. So I don't know whether we ought to be as smug as some people say, or some people seem to be with respect to the safety of our own democracy. Now, it seems self-evident that citizens cannot be expected to defend principles and values or their corresponding institutions and norms if they know little or nothing about them. A liberal constitutional democracy isn't sustainable without liberal constitutional citizens who are educated into the culture of freedom and democracy. Most civics education traditionally focuses on institutional design and on formal political process. I submit that what is required to produce what I call constitutional citizens is to instill in our youth and again in our citizens at all ages and all stages as they meet the institutions that they travel through over the course of their lives, to instill in them a sense of knowledge and deep appreciation, not just at an intellectual level, but at a visceral level, at a conditioned level, appreciation for the fundamentals of liberal democracy. Tomorrow you'll have the pleasure of hearing from Doug Blandy and from Howard Astor, who may have some other ideas about what needs to be included in a proper civics education, in an education intended to prepare citizens to be full, responsible, democratic citizens. So in that connection, the connection of fundamentals, let me offer up, with your indulgence, my secular decalogue, if you'll forgive my use of that sacred term, my secular decalogue of fundamentals for liberal democracy. Number one, every person is born and remains free and equal. Number two, every person has the right, subject to the principle of sustainability, to share in society's bounty to the extent of ensuring her welfare, so long as all wealth accumulation is consistent with the greater good and benefits the least well-off positions of society. That's a mouthful, that one. We can unpackage that a little bit later. Those of you who studied John Rawls will recognize some echoes of what he called his difference principle. What's important to understand right now is that there needs to be a principle that articulates the liberal democratic policy imperative to guard against economic inequality and to buttress and grow a strong middle class. Number three, pluralism is a cardinal societal value and an essential organizing principle of society. There are diverse ways of realizing a person's right to determine the course of her life and of her relation to culture and identity. People must be respected for what they have reason to value in their own lives and for the discrete communities to which they belong or from which they originate. Number four, apostasy is not a crime. Another Rawlsian phrase. There can be no official belief system. That's what it means. And that's why the notion of a values test for prospective citizens is so deeply repugnant. Independent conscience and belief, even including dissent from these fundamentals, must be protected. Number 5, truth and the pursuit of truth are indispensable and non-negotiable values. There can't be any shared epistemic foundation, no consensus generation, no political accountability, and certainly no justice without a societal commitment to truth-seeking. Number 6, the law shall be applied consistently, fairly, and reasonably to every person and in every case by an independent justice system. Number 7, a free people makes its own laws, selects its own leaders amongst a field of competitive contenders, and never relinquishes the right or prerogative to do so. Number 8, notwithstanding number 7, the will of the majority can never prevail if it denies or violates any of these fundamentals, subject only to the next one, which Natalie is going to be talking to us about. And that is that any limitation on these fundamentals is permissible only if it protects and advances the causes of justice, freedom, and democracy. There's a lot more to Section 1 than that, and I can't wait to hear Natalie's take on Section 1 as an accountability forum. And finally, number 10, without the stewardship and vigilance of heroic citizens, just laws and strong institutions alone will inevitably fail to safeguard freedom and democracy. That's my 10th fundamental. These fundamentals, in whatever formulation we can agree on as citizen educators, must be taught to every citizen, and certainly to every child. Heroic citizenship is not only open to each and every person, it's the fulfillment of every person's civic duty, and more than that, it's the actualization of every person's civic potentiality. And it requires more than just adherence to liberal democratic norms. It requires intervention in the name and on behalf of those norms and institutions when they're under siege or otherwise falling into disrepair. But even this is not enough. Liberal democracy is more than a complex idea or system of ideas. Ideas don't actualize themselves and institutions don't perpetuate themselves. Only motivated citizens can do that. There's nothing inevitable about the survival and perpetuity of our liberal democratic house. Ideas, as we know, may be indestructible, but structures decay and degrade and crumble. They may fall at the hands of those who would wreck them intentionally, but they may also crumble or go up in flames on the watch of negligent custodians. Think of Palmyra in the first instance and Notre-Dame de Paris in the second. Constitutional citizens will never be motivated to defend their liberal democratic home unless they're also bound together by a viscerally felt attachment to place and to each other, to community. So long as we continue to carry on under the misapprehension that we are the owners and masters rather than the humble servants and stewards of our worlds, both natural and constructed, we can't possibly hope to discharge what Mary Jo so exquisitely calls our grateful responsibility of citizenship. We must learn to treat our liberal democratic house, precious but also inescapably inadequate as it is, and the ground on which it rests, with both reverence and vigilance. That's how the darkness will lift. That's why there can be reason for hope, and that in my submission is the essence of heroic citizenship. So with that, let's get to it. Thank you.